Hey folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things. And I recently made a realistic Lego man, so I figured the next logical step is to make the video game equivalent of a Lego man, Steve from Minecraft. So I printed myself out a scale reference and noticed something immediately horrifying. Steve's arms are, quite literally, the size of his legs. Ignoring the horrifying anatomical implications of this, I got to work by tracing out a rough skeleton for my armature. I made this out of the thickest gauge wire I have and taped off the tips so that I know how long his legs need to be. I'll mount this in a big old block of wood and then wrap it in several layers of aluminium. The aluminium plays two major roles here. First, it bulks out the armature so that I don't waste as much clay building up proportions, and second, it kinda sounds nice on camera and it gives me a way to pad this video and make it longer, thus reaping that sweet ad revenue. Otherwise, with my ad revenue aluminium out of the way, I can start building up the body with clay. The goal at this point is to try and get my proportions semi-accurate while keeping the general form pretty blocky. I want Steve to have some anatomical correctness while still conforming to his cubic origins. And of course, me being me, I'm gonna make sure his butt cheeks are extra impressive. Otherwise, with his body proportions sorted and an ass you could bounce a quarter off of, it's time to ruin some childhoods. A cursory internet search showed me Steve's a pretty strong guy, so it only made sense that I would make him horrifyingly muscular. The trick here is making his muscles ridiculously large but still somehow correct, as Steve is technically a human, albeit somewhat blockier than normal, so I want to keep everything kinda accurate but within the horrifying dimensions of Minecraft. Of course, almost everything is going to be covered by his clothes in the end, but I thought it would be fun if we all suffered through a shockingly muscular Minecraft Steve together, so I'm just going to go right ahead and make all of the detail. Now, I seriously considered spending time to make him teeny tiny anatomically correct toes, complete with itty bitty toenails, but given that I'm going to be giving him shoes in the end, I decided to draw the line here and just make some basic little nubs and call it good. Otherwise, with his muscles dipping deep into the uncanny valley, I'll run over his entire body with my silicone shapers to smooth out any of the rough edges and cuts. Then of course, I'll give him some little itty bitty nipples, before gently caressing his body with a little isopropyl alcohol to blend all the edges together. Then it's time to make his head. Now, through a series of expert level maneuvers, I've made myself an appropriately sized block that will serve as Steve's head. Then I can poke a couple wide eye sockets in place before adding his nose. While I like the square head, I figured he ought to have a big beefy chin complete with one of those handsome dude dimples right in the middle. Then I can give him a set of accidentally pouty lips that I ended up laughing at enough to keep before jamming a couple of baked clay beans into his eye sockets. Then it's just a case of adding varying size of wormy dealies around the eye beans and forehead. Now, it was at about this point that I realized I had unintentionally made the love child of Steve in that Giga Chad meme, and I f***ing love it. Of course, with the chin like that, I needed to make a riser for his head, so I guess despite my best efforts, Giga Steve is getting a neck. Finally, with his neck blended into his body, I can get to work on the surface detail. I'll start by adding various wrinkles and crease lines that both give it a bit of a depth and give the paint somewhere to settle when it comes to the painting phase. I'll add some pores to his skin by gently poking his face with the tip of my softest nylon brush, before adding his ears, then giving him some eyebrows, and finally his flowing locks. Now instead of giving him an elevated goatee, I'm going to stab his face with a stiffer brush to simulate stubble so that I can paint the goatee on later. Then it's into the oven for a bake and I can add the arms. These start out as little lengths of wire I've measured to be about the same length as his legs, then they get bent into the proper angle, wrapped in wire, and then covered in a layer of mix and match Cosclay before I build up the bulk with Sculpey. I use the Cosclay as a base since it's nice and sticky and it adheres to the wire well and it makes for a good base to build the Sculpey off of. Now the reason it's a sickly green and orange color is because this is all the leftover stuff that gets stuck in my pasta machine when I'm pressing thinner sheets, so I've just scooped it out and mashed it all together. Otherwise, with my arms built up to the point that they're equal in girth to my legs, I can start mapping out my muscles. Same as I did with the legs, I want to try and stick with the human anatomy but still stay within the confines of Giga Steve's proportions. That means he's got ridiculously beefy arms that are only slightly longer than they are thick. After all, this is a guy that can punch through a 1 meter thick tree in just a few punches. Of course, he couldn't punch through said trees without some absolute hammers for fists, so I'll start with a nice big slab of clay, carve out the fingers, then try and add as much detail as possible while keeping the overall fist nice and square. Now, I have seen some theories that say Steve's arms actually end in a single finger rather than a fist, but I think in order for him to make use of the various tools and weapons, he's going to need to have a proper hand. Or at least however proper I can make them while keeping them entirely cuboid. That being said, with the hand finished, I can lop the tip off his arm nub and then jam my ham fist on the exposed aluminium bone before blending it in, creating a seamless, horrifyingly proportioned arm. Then it's into the oven for a final bake so I can prime him for his paint job. Now, while Steve is white as a ghost here, I'm fairly certain he's got something of a brown skin tone, so I'm going to start by adding lighter shades of brown washes in stages until I've worked my way up to a skin tone I think matches pretty closely with the in-game reference. Once I finally got a base I'm happy with, I'll start adding darker shading to all the cracks and creases in his skin by adding a dark wash, then dabbing away the excess with a sponge. This will leave me with some subtle and some not so subtle shading. I'll paint his hair on with a dark brown, then I'll use that same color to paint his eyebrows, and then I'll use the tip of one of my gnarly dry brushes to stipple on the darker sections of his goatee before lightly stippling on the rest of his stubble. Then his hair gets a quick frosted tip dry brush and I can get to work painting his eyes. Now with everything painted, it's finally time to cover up all the work I just did with another layer of clay, starting with his pants, which I'll make using this blue jean blue ball of Cosclay. Once I flatten the clay, I'll cut out various strips so that I can cover the lower half of his body in blue clay. Now I'm not worried about overlapping sections because they can all be blended into one another, but I do want to make sure that the cuffs of his pants and the edge of his waistline are sharp. I'd also considered giving him a pair of breezy chaps and positioning the picture in such a way that you wouldn't notice unless you watched the video, but decided against my better judgment I should probably cover them up. Otherwise, with all the exposed skin covered, I'll blend all the seams together, roll it smooth with my silicone shapers, then get to work adding a slew of creases and folds by adding strategically placed wormy dealies, then blending them into the pant legs. I decided Steve would be wearing jeans because jeans tend to be the trousers that have the most detail, so I'll add the various zippers and seams and pockets. Although in hindsight, I think it might have been kind of funny to give him a pair of cargo pants with all the pockets necessary for his millions of kilograms worth of dirt and rocks that he carries. However, with his trousers finished, it's time to give him a shirt made of this delightful blue ball of clay. This process is nearly identical to the creation of his jeans, except I'll tuck his shirt into his pants and make sure his sleeves show off his ridiculous biceps. I'm also going to lean heavily into that Giga Steve meme and use really thin clay so it looks like he's squeezing his absurdly muscular frame into a shirt that's far too small for him. Then I'll blend it all together and add more strategically placed wormy dealy wrinkles and folds. Of course, to maintain that in-game accuracy, I'll make sure to give him a slightly untucked shirt. With a shirt and trousers combo finished, it's time to make sure he gets full service and give him some shoes using a dark gray clay. This just gets mashed onto his exposed toes until I've got all the skin covered, then I'll carve away any of the excess and smooth away the rough edges until I'm left with a pretty boring, nearly square shoe. Now they were a bit too boring, so to add a little flair, I gave his shoes some tiny flaps. Otherwise, his shoes are, I guess, a little less boring, and he's been baked to lock all the clay in place, which means it's time to give his outfit some final paint touch-ups. I'll start by painting his shirt a slightly more in-game accurate aqua blue, then I'll dust the tips of the creases with a lighter shade of the same color. I'll leave the jeans the color of the clay, but tickle the tips of the creases and the details with a lighter blue to give the impression of a pair of faded jeans. Finally, his shoes will get a coat of darker gray with a lighter gray highlights and a black sole before I can finally add a little UV resin to his eyes to really round out that horror. Which means Steve is finished and it's time to make him a grassy dirt block to stand on. I'll start by roughly marking out an appropriately sized block, then cutting it out so I have 4 equal flat sides. Then I'll draw equidistant lines up and down and across all the faces so that my block is covered in a square grid pattern. Now to protect and prime my square grid pattern, I'll mix a bit of Mod Podge and brown paint and then slather it all willy-nilly over the entire surface. However, once I'd given the Mod Podge paint mix ample time to dry, I decided that the squares were a bit too big, so I tested a tighter grid on top, then did the same thing to all the sides. To paint my dirt block, I started with a dark brown base coat, covered the entire block, then worked my way through a series of slightly different shades of brown, highlighting random squares. To add the grass on top, I'm going to use my all-time favorite material, static grass. This stuff is just the tits. All I need to do is paint a little PVA glue onto all the sections of the dirt blocks that I want to cover in grass, then I load this stuff into a static grass applicator, which gives it a little jump start so that when it falls out onto the glue, it stands straight up. And once I've covered the entirety of the base in grass, I can simply tip it over, give it a couple love taps to knock the excess grass loose, and then admire my delightful little grass block. Then all that's left to do is stick Giga Steve in place, and we're onto the Glamour Shots. As always, a massive thank you to my wonderful patrons that keep this channel churning out questionable content on a weekly basis, and a very special thank you to my newest patrons, Jessica Gold, Carl Clark, Alyssa Everett, Wiley Spragasaur, Liam Spragasaur, Brooke Adams, Audrey the Amazing, Noble Gamer 24, Martin J. Coleman, Jamie Cook, Josephine, Andreas Bohr, Carla, Katrina Harkins, Jason Downs, Xander, Triforce Fusion, Beloved Mercy, Jared Palmer, Tiffany Hoyle, Rusty Shackelford, Kat Brannigan, Mr. Pumpkin, Pure Action 56, Lacoli, Red Roomba, Emily Quinn, Yavabin, Alan Paw, Adam B, and Lieutenant Colonel Thorin. You are the limitless pockets into which this channel throws its dirt, rocks, and diamonds. Now, if you like this video, then I question your taste in content. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.